Thank you very much. Let's see. Start talking about the first part of the presentation is just very generic, and it addresses the history of New Orleans going back to the first waves of immigration that brought every manner of person to New Orleans, merchants and missionaries, farmers and fishermen, and rascals and rapscallions to boot. And it's perhaps because of our very, very tenuous nature on this little crescent of land, very improbable and sometimes inhospitable. Maybe that's why the risk takers seem to come to New Orleans. And so along the way, they brought all of their diverse amusements and pleasures and entertainments. So we're gonna really spend a little bit of time talking about how, at this point in New Orleans development, there was really a social change. It was going on across America, but New Orleans as well. And it was from that agrarian economy to an industrialized economy. We had people who were not making their own clothes, they were buying their clothes, not growing their own food, but they were buying their food. And so prior to this, there was not a lot of call for organized sports. I mean, someone who spent all day, every day working on the farm did not really see a need to go exercise after work. His form of recreation might be a little bit more pleasurable, the church social, or perhaps a game of cards or something along those lines. But as they got more leisure time, you found more and more people looking at sporting events, and sports during this period of time became commercially viable. So here we have this gumbo of people coming in, Irish and Spanish and French and English. All of them are now Americans, standing shoulder to shoulder at sporting events. Some of them legal, some of them not. But there's a wide variety of them. So as we start looking at some of them, let's put it in a little social context. The playing cards. Well, certainly every tavern and inn had somebody playing some form of cards, but let's ratchet it all the way up. 1841, the Boston Club was formed, and it was named after a card game. It's not named after the city. It was named after a card game very similar to bridge or whist that was taught to the American Revolutionary soldiers by the French. And so the Boston Club gave them a venue to play cards. The dice are because the Baron de Mandeville came back 1801 from London and saw the game Hazards being played and modified it slightly, as all games go through a metamorphosis. It's sort of like stories around a campfire. And it became known as craps because the longshoremen and stevedores who adopted it would crouch down and throw and jump up and down, and they looked like hopping toads, or crapeaux. So, with that, you had all manner of sports. Down the bottom right, it gives you a whole bunch of them. With the proximity to the lake, the trains that took you out to Milneburg and Spanish Fort gave you rowing and canoeing and sailing. There's an old etching I have of water polo, and I thought, how did they get the horses in the water? Right? And not quite that, it was on wine kegs. And they had saddled the wine keg. Now, I'd love to see how they played that out and did all that. But they have that frozen in time on the barrels in the canal. And then on the bottom left, there's cockfighting. And there was all manner of blood sports were very popular. Bear baiting and dog baiting and cockfighting. I forget on which page, but there is the back of one of the police gazettes. There's an advertisement for rules. And right in the middle of the page, there is, you can send in 25 cents and get the rules for rat killing. Now, I was not sure that you actually needed to play by the rules when killing rats in Louisiana, but apparently there were strict rules about rat killing. So from all of this, I mean, there was, as I said, cycling, there's billiards and wrestling, and gymnastics, everything. But what we're going to focus on is what the golden age of sport in Louisiana talks about are the three things. During this point in time, New Orleans was absolutely the epicenter of that nationally. So let's start with boxing. Early 1830s, in the second wave of immigration, lots of Irish immigrants. And they came over as both promoters and fighters and used it as a way of making money, both as a promoter and a fighter, and to gain some social status, much the same way that blacks would do it in the mid-20th century for the same reasons. They gained some social acceptance and earned an awful lot of money in so doing. But for the most part, boxing was illegal, covered under the same city statutes as fistfighting, brawling, and general mayhem, I guess is what you might look at it that way. The police would intervene if they ever found it. The shot on the right shows police stopping a fight. This dates from around 1890 because they have gloves. Before that, it was all bare knuckle, and that's on the left. Very different at this point in time. It was under the London prizefighting rules. Now, that sounds very nice, and all tut-tut and whoosh-whoosh, but the London prizefighting rules were part boxing, part wrestling. And so you hear these tales of these mammoth fights that went on 75 rounds. Well, a round lasted as long as the fighter was standing. So this gentleman on the left of that picture, if he's going down because the other fella hit him, the round's over. If he's going down because he's avoiding the other fella's punch, the round's still over. And if he's just tired and needs a 30-second breather and he slips inadvertently, round's over. Now, most of these took place in very rural settings. Farms, fields, barnyards, saloons, not very rural, but places out of the public eye. The fight on the barge was one enterprising promoter who leased the barge, had it towed out to the middle of the river and anchored there, and then they would tender paying patrons who were carefully screened out to the barge. So if the police caught wind of it, they could collapse the whole thing and call it a big party. Okay? And we were some of the first to follow that same thing. So, London prizefighting rules got really big right about May of 1870. The gentleman on the left is the British champion, Mace, who came to New Orleans and scheduled a series of 3 bouts. Very confident that he would be able to defend his title at least twice, right? So he had 3 bouts here, maybe because there were 3 gentlemen who claimed to be the American champion, but in fact there's only one, and that's the gentleman on the right, a fellow named Tom Allen. So they scheduled the fight, but because it was illegal, they had to take the train out of the Jackson National Terminal, and they went 13 miles out of town to Kennerville, now known as Kennebunkport. No, just Kenner. And there's a statue at Rivertown that commemorates the event, not the spot of the event. The actual event took place a few hundred yards away. But this was considered to be the first world's champion prize fight, and it was held in New Orleans. And it was a harbinger of things to come. By 1882, Jarnell Sullivan, the Boston bad boy, came down to fight Paddy O'Ryan. What a great name that is. And they trained in New Orleans, and they were going to have the fight in New Orleans, and then the police got wind of it, and they tried to stop it. So they had to go over to basically Mississippi City's outside of Gulfport. And there on the front lawn of the Barnes Hotel, they had this fight that lasted about 44 minutes, and Jarnell Sullivan won. He was back again in 1889 to fight another gentleman from Boston, Jake Kilrain. Now this is where it gets interesting, because this entire fight is something that the Keystone Cops could have modeled for a movie. First we're going to look at this is an illustration of the fight in the venue. So there's oak trees and moss, and because it was such a wonderful event, there are guys hanging in the trees to see it. It's an overflow crowd. You'll notice a lot of fellows in the crowd have rifles and shotguns, and it was actually a very rowdy crowd. Kilrain's timekeeper was Bat Masterson, who was there with his brace of pistols to make sure no one fooled around with the rules, sort of a thing. Now, in order to get to where the venue was, it took no less than 2 governors, the state militia of Louisiana and Mississippi, the state police, and several Pinkertons to try and ascertain the location of the fight. And they all failed. So, here we have them coming out on July 7th out of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway and Queen and Crescent Railway. 2 sets of trains leave with the fighters, their crowd, and their fans. So here we have several thousand people leaving town. So how do you hide a train with 1,000 people? Well, they used switchbacks and all sorts of deceptive methods. Wound up going past the Louisiana-Mississippi border with the police in hot pursuit and the militia in hot pursuit, and the Governor Nichols signing executive order after executive order. You can't do this. Well, okay, we're in Mississippi. So much for your executive order. So now they stop at a little lumber town called Richebourg, and it was named for Rich's mill. And like most of it, it was because it was easily accessible to the rail siding, big open field, lots of wood to build bleachers, and a fence to keep the non-paying patrons out. And this is where Sullivan and Kilrain came. So all of the things that are added to the lexicon, such as tossing your hat in the ring, the challenger would actually toss his hat and the champion would accept. Towing the line, there was a scratch line in the middle. You met in the middle of the ring. And if you didn't toe the line, you weren't actually playing by the rules. So you had all of those things going on. So here's what the press depicted. Let's see what it actually looked like. Okay, all the skinny pine trees in Mississippi, not a hint of moss, not a fan in the trees anywhere, but you do have a couple of thousand mustachioed men in their full coats and hats in the July sun in Mississippi in 100-degree heat. And this was quite a group. You have the referee, is the future mayor of New Orleans, John Fitzpatrick. You have dignitaries and all sorts of folks in this. This photo was actually taken by Thomas Pye, who was one of the pioneers in sports photojournalism. The studio was at number 2 Poitras. So, you know, here you have a very different picture of what it actually looked like where they went. So Sullivan wins the fight. They skedaddle back because now the state police and the militia have caught up to them. They were both arrested after about a 2-week manhunt nationwide to get these egregious criminals. They were brought back to Purvis, Mississippi, where they were tried and let out on bail, and Jarnell Sullivan never crossed into Mississippi again. Jake Kilrain was brought back for trial, but had to wait because everybody in the county was at Jefferson Davis's funeral, so he had to wait an extra 2 months. Same result, second verse, right? So, round about 1890, the city of New Orleans changed all of its rules and regulations, and what you could have was permissible exhibitions at a chartered athletic club. So basically, your club could sponsor a prize fight, and it was perfectly legal. One of the most successful, down at the bottom you see, is the Olympic Club. And I'll talk a lot about the Olympic Club because it was quite a venue for its time. Here we have a ticket that was Robert Fitzsimmons on the right, who says the champion middleweight. He won that in his second fight in New Orleans at the Olympic Club, where he beat Jack Dempsey, who was the original Jack Dempsey, not the one known from the 20s and 30s. He took his name as tribute to this Jack Dempsey. He won the middleweight title. And Robert Fitzsimmons, interesting fellow, upper body of a heavyweight because he was a blacksmith, and he had the legs of a middleweight. And he had won the first title. He was challenging Peter Mayer, the heavyweight champion of Ireland, in order to become a contender for the heavyweight title. He would go on to be the first man to hold 3 different titles in 3 different weight classes, and 2 of them were in New Orleans that he did that. Now what makes this particular interesting is this next one. Wait up there. Yeah. There you go. This is an interesting depiction of the Olympic Club interior. What makes it unusual is, first you notice the rings itself. The interior ring, 8 posts, a couple of ropes. That was where the fighters were. Then there's an outer ring that you can really see sort of in the bottom left-hand side that had wire around it. Well, that was to keep the crowds out because they would get a little unruly. And that section was where the referee patrolled. And the referee you see is the gentleman in the middle in the back, Professor John Duffy, professor of pugilism at the Southern Athletic Club over in Washington, Britannia. But Professor John Duffy nonetheless. And so he didn't enter the ring unless it was called for. Down in the bottom left you see the reporters scribbling away on the little bar that is to their side. And directly above them you see one of the 4 electric lamps in the top left-hand corner. 4 electric lamps that lit the ring. Right over the two gentlemen on the right, right up that side, is the bell to signal the end of the round, the beginning of the round. So this became one of the preeminent fight venues. But what I really like about this particular engraving is the detail that the artist captured in it. And this is just a close-up. Peter Mayer had this wonderful handlebar mustache. He was famous for it. He captured that. I don't know if you can really see it, but on the shoulders and arms of the Fitzsimmons on the left, you see these large splotches. He had these enormous red freckles, which earned him the name Ruby Robert. And the artist got all of that in this one little picture from that standpoint. He actually won this fight in the 12th round to do. So let me try to keep moving here. I get behind it. But here's the one that everybody remembers. They all know Sullivan and Corbett in New Orleans. But that was actually part of the 3-day Carnival of Champions held in September of 1892. The first fight, each one was a title fight. So here we have McAuliffe and Skelly. McAuliffe was from San Francisco and pounded Skelly to nothing. The second was George Little Chocolate Dixon. I swear that's his name. And he applied such a beating on Jack Kelly that every newspaper in the South said you should never allow black men and white men to compete, to mingle, to talk to each other. And that was Dixon's last fight in the South. He did come to Kentucky to do a 4-round exhibition, but he never fought again in the South, which is a shame. He won the featherweight title. And then you had Sullivan-Corbett, which was a feature match. And what it really signaled, though, is here's a change. Here's a change of the guard between the old and the new. So you have Jarnell Sullivan, the Boston bad boy, the last bare-knuckle champion, and James Corbett, Gentleman Jim, who was the scientific art of pugilism. And, of course, who won? Corbett won. And it was just an amazing type of thing. Here's one more quick look at, not quite as good, but the Olympic Club spent some $45,000 to renovate from 3,500 seats to 10,000 seats. The area at the left-hand side, the upper area, was where the blacks were allowed for the very first time to see the Dixon fight. Segregated, but allowed into the club. And that was it. They couldn't come back for Sullivan Corbett. Okay? You can see the 4 lights. And in the swag along the top, it was a retractable roof. So when it was inclement weather, they closed it. And it was nice weather, you had breezes. And this was very much ahead of its time. Electric lights, telegraph lines. You know, so you went from this rural settings illegal to the state-of-the-art at the time. 10,000 seats. Olympic Club also hosted one of the locals. This is a photo of, or a picture rather, of Andy Bowen. And he fought this fight against a gentleman from Galveston, Jack Burke. And all the numbers are true. It is 110 rounds, 7 hours, 19 minutes, and forgivably some seconds. Burke broke every hand in both, every bone in both hands, and one wrist was broken. Mercifully, they called the fight a draw when people were thinking more about what they were going to have for breakfast than how the fight was going to come out. Those that were left. Unfortunately, Bowen plays a part in the demise of boxing. About 1.5 years later, he was fighting at the Audubon Sports Club against Kid Levine. He went down, hit his head on the mat. Well, the mat was just over a series of planks. And there was no felt lining, no padding. He fractured his skull, never regained consciousness. At that point, the city council began to act, outlawing prize fights again, and the title venues began to move west to Nevada and to California. So, horse racing. Basically, you had 4 tracks. Originally, there was the Lividay had a track near Washington and St. Charles, but that was informal. The first one was up at Hooman's house. Wade Hampton had one up there in 1814, 1815. But again, it was just farm boys racing the plow horses. The first organized ones came in 1825, the Jackson course, south of the city near Chalmette. And by 1840, when the city was the third largest city in the country, we had 4 racetracks. You had the Eclipse Course, which was just west of Audubon Park. You had the Binghamton Track in Algiers. You had the Union Course at Bayou Road and Gentilly Road. And you had the Metairie Course. The Metairie Course is right now where Metairie Cemetery is. You've probably all heard about, there was on the side where Metairie is, was the Metairie Racetrack. Opposite side where New Orleans Country Club's golf course is was the Oakland Racetrack. Where East William David and West William David was, there was a dog track. And where the Orkin building used to be, on the Orleans side, was Winkleman's Halfway House, where you could get halfway, have dinner, go right across and see all manner of sporting events, legal and illegal. But Metairie Course really came to pass under Richard Tenbrock, who was from Albany, New York, came down and managed the Binghamton Course in Algiers, and within 5 years had an ownership stake in Metairie Course. Within 10 years he owned it outright and developed it and renovated it within an inch of its life, and was the principal sponsor of one of the legendary races, Lacombe versus Lexington. Both from the same sire and different dams. They raced best 2 out of 3, and it wasn't a sprint. It was a 4-mile race. Each one 4 miles. Lexington won the first 2 in 8 minutes, just over 8 minutes, breaking the national record which had been set up in New York in 1845. And so the horses weren't even dismounted, and they were calling for a rematch and crying foul, and of course, you know, I know that never happens in sports. But they did 2 out of 3, and sure enough, Lexington won the first, Lacombe won the second, and Lexington won the third, and that was it. Lexington now resides, his skeleton that is, in the Smithsonian, and Lacombe now lies outside of Alexandria in a city that's named for him, although misspelled. So, that brings us to the Union Course, which after the Civil War, all the horse tracks were pressed into service as army hospitals, field hospitals. And after the war, only 2 came back. By 1866, the Metairie Course and the Union Course. Well, the Metairie Course was sold for a cemetery, and there's a lot of political infighting, and I know that surprises you being from Louisiana, if there's any sort of political infighting. But the fellow who was denied membership to the Louisiana Jockey Club says, I'm going to buy your course and turn it into a cemetery, and that's exactly what he did. So that left the Union Course that you know today as the Fairgrounds. The 3rd oldest course in America behind Saratoga and Pimlico, and was quite famous for having hosted, I think some of the stable owners ranged from General Custer and Sheriff Pat Garrett, and you know, they hosted kings and dukes and archdukes and dukettes and whatever else. But it was a tremendous success. And the one that I like to think of is Edward Degas, who was known to like the horse races, and he lived walking distance from the track. And I've been scouring his sketches to see any hint of this building in the background, and have not quite gotten there yet. But we'll keep looking. And that brings us to my great passion, which is baseball. Into 2 words, as it was during most of the 19th century. So what you had back then is a very different game. We all played variations of it. Rounders, town ball, and in Louisiana we had something called poison ball, which was due to the French. But in 1842, Alexander Cartwright codified the Knickerbocker rules, and baseball became the first game that we learned in America out of a book. The umpire was not there to call balls and strikes. He was there to help you interpret the ground rules. And in the early days, he sat at a table and chairs on the first base side with a book in front of him. And if you went for the rules, you got his interpretation. It was actually legal to be sitting on the bench, and a pop fly comes over your head, and you can see that the third baseman and the catcher are not going to get to it. So you could stand up from the bench and say, now catching for New Orleans, Gisclair. Catch the ball, toss it back in and say, I'm retiring. You go sit back on the bench. Well, they changed those rules. And most people think that since the game was brought in the Northeast, okay, that it came south and they taught us. Well, not so. In 1859, we had 9 teams playing in the Louisiana Baseball Association. One of them, the Southerns, all went enlisted in the Civil War together. They were all part of the 7th Louisiana Infantry, captured at the Battle of Rappahannock Station in Virginia, and all incarcerated at Johnson's Island, Ohio, on the shores of Lake Erie near Sandusky. And it was there in April of 1864 that the first baseball game between 2 different teams was played. We presented this at one of the Society of American Baseball Researchers. We took the prisoner diaries that listed the prisoners, and we took the rosters from the time, and they matched up first initial, last name to a man. Okay? So this is actually North Carolina. It's Salisbury, North Carolina. There are no pictures of Johnson's Island. I apologize. Truth in advertising. But baseball became the national game. Everyone, particularly in New Orleans, everyone had a team. Irishmen, Germans, everybody but the Chinese, they didn't have a team. Telegraph operators, gymnasts, firemen, all had a team. One of the best pieces that I ever came across, and of course now you have to, during this point in time you have to dig because there's no dedicated sports section. So baseball was relegated to the ads for male enhancement, even then, and the crime reports. And so you have to dig it out and find it. But there in the middle is an account of a game between the Boston Club and the Pickwick Club. The members have challenged each other to a best 2 out of 3. And then you go to the black newspaper and you find that during the same time, the staff of the Pickwick Club has challenged the staff of the Boston Club to the same best of 3. Now, the club rules were such that, you know, your guys play my guys with 2 out of 3, and the winner bought dinner, and the loser presented them with a trophy, a bat, a ball, something they put in the clubhouse. Now, who knows what the staff of the Boston Club and the Pickwick Club, maybe they had their own trophies, but I think they were just glad to play. So you could see that they embraced the game with as much enthusiasm, not always equal access, but still enthusiasm. So here's your first quiz. Ready? Hands on the buzzer. Who was the first professional black baseball player? Time's up. No lovely party gifts. No one answered. Okay. Moses Fleetwood Walker. Not Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson came much later. National League founded in 1872, and Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother were so devastating that Cap Anson, who's in the Hall of Fame, refused to play with them under any circumstances, beginning the segregation of Major League Baseball that didn't end until 1947. First events in New Orleans. 1870, Cincinnati Red Stockings are barnstorming. They come to New Orleans as part of their whole tour. The usual MO is to go into a town, challenge all comers, maybe 2 or 3 teams, stay a week, and then move on. They found the weather so very accommodating that they stayed a month, played 5 teams, and slaughtered all of them, sadly. Chicago raised money to send a team down here. They were going to finally beat the Red Stockings, and they missed them by a week, but they too found the climate very accommodating to burn off the winter weight, so they stayed a month, and spring training was thereby born. Stayed through the middle of the 20th century. I just spent 3 days with the fellow from Yankee magazine about when the Yankees did spring training here in 1922, 23, 24. And so it was quite a cottage industry in New Orleans at that point in time. Last one, I promise. Abner Power, who's one of the unsung heroes of baseball. Sadly, when you Google him, the story comes up that he was an outfielder who the groundskeeper's dog kept him from shagging a fly ball, and they lost on an inside the park home run. He was actually better than that. Okay? The first captain of the New Orleans Pelicans that were in the Southern League in 1887. He wouldn't become manager until the following year, and owner in 1901. He was waiting at the foot of Canal Street, or roughly in that vicinity for a steamboat to bring a player from St. Louis. It began to rain, as it sometimes does in New Orleans. He noticed the stevedores on the river covering bales of cotton, mountains of bales of cotton, with canvas tarps, because if the cotton absorbed too much water, it was too heavy to carry, and they were piecemeal workers. Well, the same thing held true in baseball. If you got a rain out, you didn't get paid. So he had the canvas tarp made to cover the infield. With all of the spring training coming down here, by 1895, every major league team had adopted the practice. On the bottom left, you see the other cause of rain in New Orleans. Tickets were basically a thick piece of cardboard. No name or date, anything on it. You had enter one, and you gave it to them when you got there, and if there was a rain event, you got a ticket to come back to another game. Well, Abner may have been a baseball player, but he wasn't dumb. And he noticed that on rain days, he was giving out more tickets than he'd actually sold. You had fence jumpers and knuckleheads of all sorts sneaking into the ballpark. So he took a blacksmith tool that was used to soften leather, had it sharpened, and perforated one side of the cardboard ticket, coming up with a rain check. Had he patented either of these things, he would have been vastly wealthy. Instead, he was forced to sell the franchise and moved to Atlanta, and he was forced to sell that franchise, moved back to New Orleans, and actually had the first putt-putt course. He had a steam automobile dealership and all manner of things. Interesting fellow. There endeth the talk. Sorry, I probably went over.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.